The stage from Cheyenne rolled into Willow Creek just as the church bell struck noon. Rosalind Whitfield stepped down into the Wyoming dust with a sleeping girl on her hip and two older children gripping the folds of her dress like they were afraid the wind might carry her away. Rosalind was 27. Rosalind was a widow. And the first thing she did before she even brushed the travel dust from her sleeves was walk straight up to the tall, sun-browned man waiting by the fence post and say the words she had rehearsed the whole long way from Nebraska. His name was Ethan Calloway. She had read his letters so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds, soft as cloth, soft as something worn near to nothing. But a letter is paper, and a platform is real. And somewhere past the last river crossing, Rosalind had promised herself she would not let this man be trapped by his own good manners. So she said it plainly, before he could smile, before he could pretend, before he could do the kind thing now and take it back later. No man wants a wife who comes with 3 children already grown around her heart, Mr. Calloway. I would understand if you've changed your mind. I would not blame you one bit. I came all this way so you could tell me so to my face. A man ought to be allowed that. Ethan Calloway did not answer right away. He looked at Rosalind. Then he looked down at the girl asleep on her hip, barely 3 years old, one small fist curled around a scrap of blue ribbon. Then he looked at the boy of 8, standing straight-backed and wary, and the girl of 11, who held her mother's sleeve so tightly her knuckles had gone white. And then Ethan smiled. It was a slow smile, the smile of a man who has just been handed something he wanted for a very long time and can hardly believe is real. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I always hoped for a full house. I just never thought I'd be fortunate enough to get one all at once." Rosalind did not smile back. She stood very still while the wind moved the dust around their boots, and the littlest one, whose name was Ivy, opened her eyes and looked up at the tall stranger with the wide, unafraid curiosity of a child who has not yet learned what it costs to be too much for someone. But Rosalind had learned. She had learned it the hard way over 2 long years, and a kind word from a stranger was not enough to undo it in one afternoon. Before this story goes further, understand something. The hard part was never what Ethan said on that platform. He meant every word of it. The hard part was that Rosalind did not believe him, because 2 years of hard living had taught her that kindness toward a widow with 3 children was a thing that wore thin, and a person learns not to lean on a gift they are certain will be taken back. The eldest, the watchful one, was named Josephine, Josie for short. 11 years old, with her mother's habit of bracing for the worst before it arrived, she looked up at Ethan Calloway and did not loosen her grip on her mother's sleeve. The middle child, a boy named Samuel, was already looking past the man toward the horses tied at the rail, because he was 8 years old, and horses were horses, and nothing in the world was more interesting. Ethan reached for the single trunk sitting in the wagon bed, the only trunk, because 3 children and 1 trunk was the whole of what Rosalind Whitfield owned in this world. "Let's get you all out of this wind," he said. "It's a fair ride out to the place, and that little one looks tired." Rosalind let him take the trunk because there was nothing else to do, but she kept her arms tight around Ivy and her chin lifted high, and she waited, the way she had learned to wait, for the moment this kind man would remember exactly what he'd agreed to. To understand why a kind word could not reach Rosalind Whitfield, you have to know what the last 2 years had carved into her. She had been married to a good man, Nathaniel Whitfield, in a small town along the Nebraska river bottoms, a house that was not grand but was warm, 3 children, and a quiet, ordinary happiness that neither of them thought to call lucky because it simply was their life. Nathaniel worked the grain mill. Rosalind kept the house and raised the children. It was a small life. It was enough. Then came the fever.
It moved through the town the way fevers do in the cold months, house to house, down the lane, taking the very old and the very young, and sometimes, cruelly, a man in the prime of his strength. It took Nathaniel Whitfield, 30 years old, healthy as a plow horse, gone from well to buried in 8 days. Remember that fever. Remember how fast it moved, how it left Rosalind standing helpless at a bedside with nothing to do but watch. It matters, again, before this story is through. After Nathaniel died, Rosalind was a widow with 3 children and very little money. There was small savings, but small savings do not stretch far across 4 mouths, a landlord's due each month, and a Nebraska winter. She took in sewing, she took in washing, she did every respectable thing a woman in her position could do, and still she watched the savings dwindle like water leaking from a cracked jar. Here's what hardened inside Rosalind over those 2 years. It was not the labor. She could work, and did, without complaint. It was the way people's faces changed when they looked at her children. The landlord saw 3 more reasons the rent might come up short. The few men who came calling after a respectable period of mourning looked at Josie and Samuel and little Ivy and did arithmetic behind polite smiles, counting the years until the children were grown, counting the cost of feeding them until then. Rosalind watched one man's expression shift at her own supper table the evening Samuel knocked over his cup, and in that single flickering change, she understood precisely what she was worth now on the open market of second chances. A widow alone might be a prize to some lonesome man. A widow with 3 children was, to most, a debt. So when she saw the advertisement in the back pages of a farm circular, she nearly didn't answer it. A rancher out in the Wyoming territory, seeking a wife, writing plainly that he had good land, a sound house, and more loneliness on it than a man ought to carry alone. Rosalind read it 4 times before she let herself write back, and in her very first letter, in the second line, before anything else, she put down the truth like she was daring him to run from it.
I am a widow with 3 children, a girl of 11, a boy of 8, and a girl not yet 3. And I will not come without them, and I will not pretend they are anything less than a handful. She wrote it on purpose to scare him off early, where it would cost nothing, rather than late, where it would break her all over again. And then she waited for the silence she had come to expect. The silence did not come. What came back was a letter from Ethan Calloway that never once mentioned the children as a burden. He wrote about the land, the long winters, the good green summers in the valley. And almost as an afterthought, at the very end, he wrote one line that Rosalind read so many times she could recite it in her sleep. A house full of children is the only kind of house I have ever wanted. So don't think you're bringing me trouble. You're bringing me the very thing I've been short of. She didn't believe that line either. She told herself it was just a lonely man's way of filling a page. But she was out of savings and out of time, and Wyoming was far from the changed faces of Nebraska. So she packed her one trunk, gathered her 3 children, and went west to find out what a sentence in a letter was really worth. Now, you should know something about Ethan Calloway, because Rosalind did not yet know it, and it matters more than anything. Ethan was 33, raised in a loud, crowded house in Missouri, one of 6 children, a home that was never quiet, always a child laughing or crying or underfoot, always too many at the supper table, always noise, and he had loved it in the particular way you only understand you loved something after it's gone. Because that house did not stay full. A fever, the same breed of fever that had taken Nathaniel Whitfield, swept through and took 2 of his younger brothers in a single terrible week. The rest scattered, the way grown children do, west and south and away, chasing their own lives. His mother passed a few winters later. His father followed not long after. And Ethan Calloway, who had built a fine ranch in the Wyoming Valley with his own 2 hands, found himself standing in a good house on good land in a silence so complete it rang in his ears. At night, He had everything a man was supposed to want, and he would have traded a good portion of it for the simple sound of too many feet on the stairs. The Calloway Ranch sat in a wide green fold of land an hour's ride from Willow Creek. The house was bigger than Rosalind had pictured, a real parlor, 4 rooms upstairs. Walking through it that first afternoon with Ivy on her hip, she did a thing she couldn't help doing. She counted the rooms and thought, there is space here for us to disappear into, space to stay out of his way. Because that was her plan. In those first weeks, Rosalind's whole plan was to make her 3 children as small and as little trouble as 3 children could possibly be. She hushed Samuel when he got loud. She kept Ivy tucked in the kitchen, underfoot of no one but herself. She had Josie helping with chores until the girl, only 11, looked tired in a way a child shouldn't look. Rosalind was trying to prove her children cost nothing. And the strange thing she couldn't see was that her trying was the only thing in that house making anyone unhappy. Ethan noticed within the week. He noticed Samuel go quiet and stiff the moment he walked into a room, like a boy who'd been warned 100 times not to bother the man of the house. He noticed Rosalind sweep Ivy out of the parlor the instant he sat down, as though a small girl with a scrap of ribbon needed apologizing for. And he noticed Josie watching him the careful way you watch a dog you haven't yet decided is friendly. It was Samuel who broke the careful quiet first, and it was over the horses. He'd been staring at them since the platform, and one morning he couldn't stand it any longer and slipped out to the corral while his mother's back was turned. Rosalind found the corral empty of her son, and her heart leapt into her throat. She ran out calling his name, already composing an apology in her head. But there was no anger to apologize to. There was Samuel sitting on the top rail of the fence, and there was Ethan standing beside him with his hand resting on the neck of a gentle old gray mare, showing the boy how to let a horse smell your hand before you ever try to touch it. Ethan was talking low and easy, the way you talk to a nervous boy and a nervous horse both at once. Samuel was listening with his whole small body. Rosalind stopped at the corner of the barn, and not knowing what to do with what she was seeing, said too sharply, "Samuel, you mustn't trouble Mr. Calloway." Ethan looked over at her then and said something she would turn over in her mind many nights after. "Mrs. Whitfield, a boy who wants to learn horses isn't trouble. A boy who wants to learn horses is the best company a man could ask for. Let him be." Then he turned back to the mare and the boy, and Rosalind stood there with her unused apology still in her mouth, not knowing where to put it down. Ivy was next to cross the careful line her mother had drawn. Ivy carried a small rag doll everywhere, worn soft with love, one button eye, a scrap of blue ribbon always tied round its wrist to match her own. One evening, the doll's arm finally gave at the seam and tore loose, and Ivy wept the bottomless, world-ending weeping of a very small child who has lost the one thing that is wholly, entirely hers. Rosalind was upstairs with Josie. It was Ethan who was in the kitchen when the doll came apart, and Rosalind, hurrying down at the sound of crying, stopped dead on the bottom step, because there was Ethan Calloway, a big man, hands like saddle leather, a man who broke horses and mended fence lines, sitting at the kitchen table with Ivy's torn doll, a needle and a spool of thread, sewing the little arm back on. His stitches were huge and clumsy. He had plainly never sewn a doll in his life, but he did it slow and careful, with Ivy leaning against his knee, her tears already drying, entirely certain that this quiet giant of a man could fix anything in the world. Remember that doll. Remember the clumsy stitches. It comes back at the end of this story, and when it does, you'll want to remember this kitchen, this needle, this man who didn't know how to sew and sat down and tried anyway. Josie was the hardest to reach. She had watched her father die. She had watched the changed faces back in Nebraska, same as her mother had, because children see far more than grown people ever give them credit for. Somewhere in those 2 hard years, Josie had decided her job was to help her mother and trust absolutely no one else. She did that job well. She was polite to Ethan, she was helpful, and she gave him nothing of herself at all, watching him always, waiting for the face she was certain he was hiding. Ethan did not push her. He simply let her watch. He didn't try to buy her trust with gifts or win her over with some grand gesture. He just kept being the same man, day after day. The man who let Samuel learn the horses, who sewed a torn doll's arm, who never once raised his voice. And he let Josie take all the time on earth she needed to discover that the same man on Monday was still the same man on Friday. For a watchful child, there is no gift greater than that. A watchful child does not want presents. A watchful child wants proof that the floor will hold. And through all of it, Rosalind would not let herself exhale. She saw Ethan with Samuel and the horses. She saw the clumsy stitches in the doll's arm. She saw the room he was giving Josie to breathe. And still, she waited for it to end, because she had seen kindness before, and she had seen it wear thin, and she had decided it was safer to keep her children small and her own heart smaller than to believe in a thing that might only be taken back. Then, Ivy took sick. Of course it was Ivy, the littlest, not yet 3. It began as a flush in her cheeks and a crossness she couldn't explain. By the 2nd evening, she was hot to the touch and wouldn't eat. By the 3rd night, she was burning, truly burning, the kind of fever that shakes a small body from the inside. Rosalind came undone in a way she had not allowed herself to come undone in 2 years, because she had seen a fever like this before. She had watched it take Nathaniel in 8 days. She sat on the edge of Ivy's bed with a cool cloth and hands that would not stop shaking, and the old terror rose up in her, the terror of watching, of being helpless, the terror she had carried all the way west and believed, foolishly, she had left behind. Ethan heard her moving in the night and came to the door. One look at Ivy, flushed and shivering. One look at Rosalind's white face, and he didn't say a single soft, useless word.
Said, "I'll ride for Doc Hale. It's a hard hour in the dark, but the horse knows the road." And he was pulling on his boots before she could even answer. Here is where Rosalind's fear and her hope ran headlong at each other in the dark. A small, cruel voice, 2 years in the making, whispered, "Now he sees. Now he sees what a ready-made family truly costs. A sick child in the night, a doctor's bill, a fever that could run through all of them. Now he'll start counting, the way they all start counting." She almost wished he would. It would have been easier to lose this now than to keep on hoping. But Ethan Calloway did not count. He rode the hard hour into Willow Creek through the black dark and brought Doc Hale back before dawn. When the doctor had examined Ivy and said it was a bad fever, but a child's fever, the kind that breaks if it's watched and cooled and kept, Ethan did not go to bed. He sat up that whole night and the next day and the night after, taking turns with Rosalind at Ivy's bedside, wringing the cloth, talking low to the little girl when she fretted, carrying her to the window when she wanted to see the stars. On the second night, with Ivy finally sleeping a real sleep and the worst of the fever turning at last, Rosalind sat across the small bed from Ethan in the lamplight, both of them gray with exhaustion, and she finally asked the thing she'd been holding in for weeks. She asked it in a whisper so as not to wake Ivy. "Why are you doing all this? She isn't yours. None of them are yours. You could have taken a wife with no children at all. Why would you sit up 2 nights for a child that isn't your own?" Ethan looked across the sleeping child at her, too tired now to be anything but honest. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I had 2 brothers die of a fever just like this one when I was a boy. I remember my mother sitting up exactly like this, and I couldn't do a single thing for them. I was too small. I've carried that my whole life." He looked down at Ivy. I can do something for this one. Do you understand? You think these children are something you're asking me to carry. They are not. They are the very thing I've been waiting my whole life to be allowed to carry. Remember that fever back in Nebraska, the one that took Nathaniel? The same breed of fever had come again, and this time it did not win. This time there was a man who would ride an hour through the dark, a doctor brought back before sunrise, and two people sitting up across a small bed until the fever finally turned. Ivy woke on the third morning hungry and cross, and entirely herself, and asked for her doll. And that was how they knew she was truly well. Josie had seen all of it. She hadn't slept much either those 2 nights, because she never slept when her family was afraid. She watched Ethan ride out into the dark. She watched him come back with the doctor. She watched him sit up 2 nights running for her baby sister. And somewhere in those 2 nights, the floor she had been so certain would fall away did not fall away. It held. And a watchful child who finally finds that the floor holds is a child who can, slowly, begin to stand on it. It was Josie, not Rosalind, who said the first true thing. On the third morning, with Ivy well and the house able to breathe again, Josie found Ethan at the kitchen table and stood in front of him the careful way she did everything. "Thank you for getting the doctor for Ivy," she said. Then, 11 years old, she added the thing that mattered. "My pa would have done that." And then she turned red and hurried off, because she hadn't meant to say quite so much. But she had said it, and Ethan sat very still at that table a long while after, understanding exactly what a watchful child had just handed him, and knowing it was the most precious thing in that entire house. The conversation that mattered most came a week later, in the evening, the children long asleep upstairs in rooms Rosalind had once thought of only as places to be small in. She came down to the kitchen and found Ethan still up, mending a length of harness by lamplight. She sat across from him and for the first time in 2 years found she could not keep her chin up and her heart small any longer. The fever had cracked something open in her. "I've been waiting for you to change your mind since the day I stepped off that stage," she said, her voice shaking now. "I kept the children quiet, kept myself out of your way, because I was so sure that if I stayed small enough, you wouldn't notice how much you'd taken on, and you wouldn't send us away. In Nebraska, I watched men sit at my table and count my children like a bill they weren't certain they wanted to pay. I learned that a woman with 3 children is a thing the world treats as too much, a burden a kind man carries for a while and then sets back down. I came here believing that about myself, Mr. Calloway. I think some part of me still does. I don't know how to stop."
Ethan set the harness down and listened, the way he was good at listening. Then he told her the whole of it, not the short version from his letter, but everything. The house in Missouri full to the rafters with 6 children and noise. The fever that took 2 brothers in 1 week. His mother sitting up, just as Rosalind had sat up with Ivy. His siblings scattering west and south and away. His parents passing. The day he understood he was standing alone in a good house, on good land, in a silence that rang in his ears. "I built all this," he said, looking around the quiet kitchen, "and every single nail I drove, I was thinking it was for a house full of people. Then the house was finished, and there was no one in it but me. Do you know what that's like, Mrs. Whitfield? To finally get the thing you worked your whole life for and find the people it was meant for are gone or grown or never came at all?" Then Ethan Calloway said the words Rosalind would keep for the rest of her life, words she would repeat to Josie and Samuel and Ivy when they were grown, and asked how it had all begun. He leaned forward into the lamplight. "I need you to hear me. You did not bring me a burden. You brought me back the one thing my money and my land could never buy. You brought the noise back into my house. You brought feet onto the stairs. There is not a man alive who wanted your 3 children more than I do, because there is not a man alive who has been as lonesome in a full-sized house as I have." It was the first time he had called her by her first name and not Mrs. Whitfield. She noticed. And Rosalind, who had not cried in front of another living soul in 2 years, who had kept her chin up through the fever and the funeral and the slow bleeding out of every last savings, finally put her face in her hands at that kitchen table and wept. Not from sorrow, but from the terrible relief of setting down a weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was a weight at all. Ethan did not reach across the table and grab at her the way a lesser man might. He waited, and when she had cried herself quiet, he said one more thing, plain and steady. "We'll be married proper whenever you're ready, no sooner. But I'd be obliged if you'd stop keeping those children quiet on my account. This house was built for noise. Let it be noisy." And Rosalind laughed, a wet, broken, entirely real laugh, and said yes. Not just yes to the marriage, but yes to the larger thing, yes to believe in it, which, for Rosalind, was by far the
Harder, yes, and the one that had taken a fever and 2 sleepless nights and a man who didn't know how to sew but sat down and tried anyway. They were married that autumn in the little church at Willow Creek, all 3 children standing up front with them, and the minister said it was the first wedding he had ever performed, where the bride arrived with her own row of family already filling the pews. Samuel learned the horses properly. By the next summer, he could saddle the old gray mare all on his own, and Ethan told anyone in town who'd listen that the boy had a natural hand with animals, and Samuel glowed under it the way a boy glows when a man he loves is proud of him. Ivy grew the way the littlest ones always do, fast and sideways, and she followed Ethan everywhere, and he let her, even when following meant getting underfoot at every turn. And Josie, the watchful one, took the longest, because trust that is hard won is trust that holds. But there came a day, nearly a year on, when Josie called Ethan something other than Mr. Calloway. She did it quietly, without ceremony, the way she did everything. She simply said, "Pa, the gate's come loose again," as if she'd been saying it her whole life. Ethan had to turn away and look hard at that gate a long moment before he could answer, because his eyes had gone wet, and a man doesn't much like his oldest girl seeing him cry over a loose gate. Remember Ivy's rag doll, the one Ethan sewed back together that first week with his big, clumsy stitches? That doll lasted for years. Ivy carried it long after she was far too old for dolls, and those crooked stitches in its arm never came out because she wouldn't let anyone fix them properly. When Rosalind once offered to sew the arm neat, Ivy, older by then, simply said, "No, leave it. That's how I know it's mine." And Rosalind left it. Of course she left it. The house was never quiet again. There were feet on the stairs and spills at the supper table, and too many voices talking over one another every evening. And Ethan Calloway, who had once stood alone in a good house in a silence that rang in his ears, would sometimes stop right in the middle of all that noise and simply listen to it, a look on his face like a man hearing music. Rosalind saw that look more times than she could count, and every time she saw it, she remembered the platform at Willow Creek, the dust, the dread, and the words she had said before he could even be kind to her. "No man wants a bride with 3 children." And she remembered what he had answered, the truest words anyone had ever said to her. "I always hoped for a full house. I just never thought I'd be fortunate enough to get one all at once." What makes a story like this worth telling is not the wedding, and it is not the ranch. It is the simple, quiet truth that love does not count what it gives, it only counts what it gains. A family is not measured by what it costs someone to keep it, but by how much fuller a house becomes once it is let in.